Saturday Agenda.
Hello and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Peter van Onselen. Well, you know the Prime Minister's in trouble when everyone tells you that they're pledging their support to her. The reality here is that Julia Gillard has got her problems. There's reports that large chunks of the left have deserted her. The right are sticking with her, not so much because they trust what they think she can deliver, but they're fearful of the man that looks like the most likely alternative at the moment, and that is Kevin Rudd. The biggest strength that the Prime Minister has in her favour is that there is no clear alternative. However, there are a gaggle of possibilities, including Stephen Smith, someone that I've been writing about as the best option for them to go to. But in this mirth, or in this situation that they've got, the Prime Minister's problems are pretty obvious. And when you've got a series of Labor premiers in particular rolling themselves out one by one, led by Peter Beattie, Bob Carr adding to the mix, this reeks of the Prime Minister's office doing the ring around, trying to drum up as much support as possible. We saw the Prime Minister talk to David Spears, the political editor on Sky, yesterday in an attempt to defiantly say she's going nowhere. Well, we'll see about that. I'm not sure that it's necessarily up to her. Certainly at the moment she's going nowhere, but that's simply because the New South Wales right haven't decided whether she's going anywhere or not. To discuss these issues, joining me here in the Sky studio on the far end of the panel, Troy Bramston, former speechwriter no less to Kevin Rudd. Thanks for your company.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be back.
And as always, Dr Greg O'Mahony. Thanks for your company as well.
Good to be here, Pete.
And we're joined out of Perth by Senator Matthias Cormann, Shadow Assistant Treasurer. Senator, thanks for your company as well.
Yeah, good to be here. Good morning.
Senator, can I come to you first? I mean, obviously you'd be trembling in your boots about this particular interview. The Coalition have been so much in the press. There's a lot out there that you'd be worried about. How are you seeing the state of play for the government at the moment?
Well, I mean, the state of play is that we've had for some time now a very bad, incompetent government in Canberra, and whenever you think it can't get any worse, it does. I mean, this is a bad government which is going from bad to worse. It is a terrible situation for Australia. The shuffling of chairs on the deck of the Titanic is not going to, be enough to resolve this issue either. Quite frankly, it's time that the government took this to an election.
Let me just come and bring the panel in on this. I mean, the only thing, you're not going to get Senator Cormann acknowledging this, but what about the other side of it being that it wasn't that long ago that the Liberal Party was cycling their way through leaders, and once they found the right one, in the shape of Tony Abbott, they almost won an election. They now look like they're on a path to an almost certain election victory. Is there a chance that Labor could get itself into a similar position, or is it just different when you're in government and you've had problems?
Well, look, it's such a poison chalice, isn't it? I mean, you've got all these issues that the government just hasn't been able to resolve or get traction on. Whether it's, the mining tax, still opposition to that, but it'll probably pass. Carbon tax, still significant opposition to that, but that'll probably pass. And now the asylum seeker, refugee, immigration policy is just a mess for the government. Its credibility is clearly in tatters on that issue, and it has been for the past 10 years. So who would want the Labor leadership right now? I don't think that anyone would be in a hurry to put their hand up for it.
Well, yeah, I think it is different. I think the biggest mistake Gillard's made is walking away from her biggest contribution to Australian history. She knifed a first-term Prime Minister. She never stared down the barrel of the camera and explained why, and explained to the public what you know, Pete, and you know as well, Troy, which he was a dysfunctional leader. That senior ministers in his government hadn't spoken to him personally for almost 2 years. And we've now got this bizarre situation where people are saying maybe he's the man for the job.
Matthias Cormann, if you're a betting man on this, I mean, I know you're not going to be giving free advice to the Labor Party, but do you think that the Prime Minister will survive this because of, I guess, the practical difficulties of moving her on in a minority parliament, or do you think that she will go, and if so, what happens then?
Well, look, I'm not going to give gratuitous advice to the Labor Party on what they should do with their personnel arrangements, but let me just make the point that when Tony Abbott became leader of the Liberal Party, it was over an issue of policy, and the Liberal Party had a very robust internal discussion on policy, and we settled on a very clear direction where there is strong unity around the coalition in relation to that particular policy issue relating at the time to the emissions trading scheme. Whereas in the Labor Party, I mean, whether it's Kevin Rudd, whether it's Stephen Smith, whether it's Simon Crean, whether it's Julia Gillard, if you're still going to have those dud policies, the carbon tax, the mining tax, the border protection fiasco, unless you resolve the policy, you're not going to actually make any fundamental change that's going to take Australia forward positively.
Senator, I'm glad that you raised the policy, because there's a report in The Australian today on page 8 by Sid Marr Abbott plan to cost double Labor's carbon scheme. And this is a Freedom of Information request that was done by the Australian, and it shows that Treasury analysis reveals that if you are going to get to the 2020 target of 5%, and this is a bipartisan target, there's going to be a much more significant cost on the coalition scheme because you're not willing to take into account abatement permits from abroad. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, we don't accept that. I mean, we have, very clear third-party analysis which suggests that Treasury modelling of the government scheme completely underestimates the impact of the government's carbon tax on the budget, on the economy, on jobs and so on. And of course, look, I mean, the Treasury is working for the government. So, I mean, you obviously always got to take with a grain of salt whatever sort of assessment comes out of Treasury in that context.
I'll put that swipe at the independent civil servants to one side. But what about the fact that this is another example of the coalition arguing with Treasury over modelling? I mean, we saw this with the so-called $11 billion black hole that Labor keeps attacking you about from the election promises. Once again, you disagree with the Treasury modelling. Now, that's the same Treasury modelling, by the way, Senator, which says what the cost of the government scheme are going to be, which you then use to attack the cost of that scheme. So if you're not going to use it for its costing of how expensive your scheme will be, surely you can't rely on it for your gratuitous attacks, dare I say, on the government.
Well, no, I'm not. This is, by the way, not my sort of attack on independent civil servants. I chair the Senate Carbon Tax Inquiry, as you know, and we had before us Danny Price from Frontier Economics yesterday in Geelong. Thursday, rather. And, I mean, he's done modelling for state Labor governments, like the state Labor government in New South Wales, and for state coalition governments. So he's well and truly independent in these sorts of matters. And he very clearly pointed out to us that the assumptions that were used by the government in the Treasury modelling of the carbon tax were not plausible. The way they've used unrealistic assumptions actually has a direct impact in underestimating the impact that the carbon tax will have on the economy, on jobs, on cost of living pressures and so on. So that is not my criticism. That is independent analysts that have expertise in these matters making these observations.
Craig and Troy, let me bring you in and ask you, I mean, off the back of this, at one level there's a who cares factor at the moment given the internal ructions for the government. This is the kind of story that you can imagine being quite bigger when the climate change debate was front and centre, which it isn't at the moment. But is there any likelihood that this is going to cause problems for the opposition over time, do you think?
Maybe over time, certainly not in the next 10 days. But I think it's interesting hearing what the Senator just said about the clear unity within the coalition and within the Liberal Party on one issue, the ETS. And I'm not sure exactly how that meshes with the fact that Abbott was elected by one vote. Internally.
Well, times change would be the answer to that, I think. I mean, there wasn't a lot of unity then when he won by one vote, but success begets success, I suppose.
Malcolm Turnbull out there regularly saying that he supports an emissions trading scheme. He's not a big fan of the coalition's policy, but he's part of the coalition front bench. I think the reality here is, we can talk about the coalition's
He's pretty isolated,
policy.
though, in the coalition. I mean, far be it from me to take the Senator's side on this, but, at the end of the day...
That's exactly right, I think. And the Senator, of course, is going to, raise those issues about frontier economics and so on, but there really isn't a lot of mainstream senior economists backing the coalition's policy. But that doesn't really matter because this is a political issue here, and I think the coalition's policy is predicated on the opposition to the government's policy, and on that they're on a winner. And it really doesn't really matter anymore, I guess, what the coalition's policy is, if you're just talking about the pure politics of the situation.
Senator Cormann, can I just ask you on another matter? Page 2 of the Australian today, there's a report about LNP revolt as Mal Brough win looms. He's looking to become the chair, I think it is, of the Electoral Council within the division that Peter Slipper represents up in Queensland. Now, Peter Slipper has made it clear that if the coup is successful, my position as a parliamentary member of the LNP becomes untenable. This would not be helpful to the coalition in a hung parliament where every vote counts. Wouldn't this give Julia Gillard that one extra number that she needs to either dump Craig Thompson if she has to, or simply to have a little bit of parliamentary fat to withstand the onslaught in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I mean, there's obviously internal pre-selection processes underway in Queensland, and no doubt the LNP will make the decision as they see fit in the best interest of the LNP and in the best interest of the people of Fisher. And obviously, from our point of view, we will continue to focus on holding a very bad government to account and on putting them under pressure, trying to force them to deliver better government than what we're currently getting. And ultimately, we take the view that it's actually time to go to a general election so that people can have a say about the bad performance of this government so far.
Sure, but if I can bring the panel in, I mean, at the end of the day, Peter Slipper is someone that it was known there was some speculation whether he might accept the Speaker's position over Harry Jenkins to give Labor one extra number effectively in the Parliament. He ended up taking the deputy position against the desires of his own side of the Parliament. I mean, he's egging for a portrait on the wall at Parliament House, I would suggest, in the Speaker's role, and this is perhaps one further step in that direction.
I think that's right, and I think.
Well, I don't accept the assertions in all of that. I mean, I don't think that. I think that Peter Slipper is very much a member of the coalition team, and I would expect him to continue to be a member of the coalition team moving forward.
Do you think he's a high-performing member of the coalition team?
You know, he works very hard for the people of Fisher.
He speaks very highly of you, Senator, too.
All right. Bring the panel in, though. What are your thoughts about this situation? I mean, you know, it's kind of there's a sense of it that it's all coming a little bit too late from my perspective, looking at it in terms of, you know, good news for the government. At the moment, it's just completely overshadowed. This would have been better news 6 months ago when Julia Gillard wasn't quite in the position she's in now.
I think so much of the way this government is governed has been predicated on every seat counting and just needing every seat, keeping right on side, responding as they have to Craig Thomson. And I think if there was...
Do you think this is a big deal then?
Well, I think it could be. I think I like your expression, a little bit of parliamentary fat. I think if they could have a little bit of room to move, they may well change how they approach some individuals.
Well, Troy Bramson, the other parliamentary fat that they could acquire is by putting Kevin Rudd in the job, having Bob Katter come across. They're quite good mates. If Kevin Rudd took over, then they've maybe got one extra number, two peas in a pod there, Kevin Rudd and Bob Katter, if ever you need an example that Queensland is not a homogenous state. You know, that's another potential number.
Well, it is, but I mean, it's a hypothetical, and you know, just to say, you know, I'm not advocating a change in the leadership, but let's just say Kevin Rudd was made Labor Party leader again and Prime Minister again. He may lose some of the other independents that Gillard has on side. So, you know, there's conflicting stories in the papers today. Are the independents locked into Gillard as a person, or are they locked into Labor? Journalists keep writing different stories. I think on balance, what I've heard them say is that they would just assess the situation again if there was a change of leadership, and we don't know how that would go. But you're right about Bob Katter. I think he would support Kevin Rudd.
I'm not sure I can agree with that. I saw Tony Windsor quoted in yesterday's papers as saying he can't imagine any circumstance under which he would impose Tony Abbott on the Australian people. And that's something I'd love to ask the Senator is, there's clearly a huge amount, Senator, of personal animosity between Abbott and the independents. That's a fair question, Senator Cormann. I mean, at the end of the day, the coalition almost seems to have moved to a strategy now where it wants the election. It no longer wants to try to change the government within the current parliamentary structures. Would you agree with that?
Well, we think that the Australian people deserve an election so they can have a say about policies like the carbon tax, which we were promised before the election we wouldn't get, and which we're now getting as a result of, you know, the Labor Party and people like Tony Windsor and others trying to impose it on us without having actually taken it to the election before the election.
OK, Senator, can you stay with us? We're going to take a commercial break, but when we come back, I want to keep discussing, I guess, the central issue of the week, which is the problems of the government. But I would like to get back to what it could mean on your side if the likes of Mal Brough do work their way into Parliament. There's still a fair bit of speculation, not just about him, but about some other potential returns for the Liberal Party. You're watching Saturday Agenda. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Saturday Agenda. I'm joined out of Perth by Senator Matthias Cormann, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, and here in the studio, Troy Bramson, former speechwriter to Kevin Rudd, and Dr Greg O'Mahony, who joins me each week. Senator, can I come to you on and ask you, I guess, about the Prime Minister under pressure this week? She still found time, however, to cut into the credibility of our Chief Justice, French. An unusual situation, to say the least. I called it today in an article I wrote for The Australian, borderline infringing on the separation of powers. At the end of the day, it's not a good look. Now, you know, ministers in the Howard government of old have cut into members of the judiciary as well, but I can't think of a time that I've seen a Prime Minister go quite as hard as this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Julia Gillard is clearly under pressure. I mean, I think on that she completely lost the plot. You've got a Prime Minister who is getting stuck into the highly respected Chief Justice of the High Court in Robert French, who was just doing his job. Yet she's got full confidence in Craig Thomson, who is unable and unwilling to explain as to why and how his union-issued credit card was used to pay for prostitutes. Like, so, I mean, I think she's clearly sort of getting her priorities a little bit wrong as to who she has confidence in and and who she doesn't.
I've got to bring Troy Bramston in on that one. I mean, you know, you're a former Young Labor president in New South Wales. Are you of one mind with the Prime Minister about her confidence in Craig Thomson and her concerns about Justice French?
Well, I'm not so sure about Craig Thomson. I mean, the allegations against him have been widely canvassed and they're pretty damning. But, look, I mean, in the issue of the High Court criticism, I was actually quite surprised. And I don't think that was a positive development. Normally it's coalition members of governments that criticise institutions.
He's a Labor appointee, apart from anything else.
Well, that's exactly
positive
right.
development.
Well, he's a Labor appointee, in fact, with a Liberal Party background. But apart from that...
But he was still appointed by the Labor Party.
Of course he was. And it was not the right thing to be doing.
Not that it would be all right, by the way, if he was appointed by the Liberals.
No, well, the Labor Party traditionally has been someone who supports institutions. It's the coalition parties who have a record of attacking institutions. And you know,
I'm not sure
you
about
mentioned
that. The Conservatives are known as the traditional supporters of institutions.
Well, not things like the ABC, the ABC, the High Court in the past. Tim Fischer, you know, criticised the High Court. The Howard government was very critical about the High Court on the Wick decision. So look, it has happened before, probably not at a prime ministerial level. I don't think it was particularly helpful. But then again, you know, as Paul Kelly argues in the Australian, this was the High Court intervening in government policy making, and it's a dangerous development.
Greg O'Mahony, you're a barrister. What are your thoughts about the nature of this onslaught by the Prime Minister, who herself is a former law partner, on the judgment? I mean, there's a difference there, isn't there, between disliking the judgment or indeed being a commentator. Paul Kelly today in the Australian talks about how bad a judgment it is versus a Prime Minister sort of coming out quite as hard as she did.
Yeah, I think it was a brain snap. I think it looked incredibly un-prime ministerial. But also, I agree with you. It is, you know, a big part of the constitutional setup in Australia is the separation of powers, and it's just not the done thing to have a Prime Minister comment on the highest court in the land in the way she did. I'm sure she regrets it. We saw the Attorney General come out hours after she made her comments with a press release saying he had full support, that the High Court had his full support. Now, that is an incredibly messy afternoon for an Australian government. I don't accept at all that there's any historical precedent for it. I've never seen a Prime Minister speak about the High Court like that.
Senator Cormann, is this just another example of why we need a change of Prime Minister? Because we all know that Tony Abbott, he doesn't have those kind of brain snaps. He's a much more steady hand when it comes to his public commentary.
Well, I mean, Tony Abbott is a very steady hand, and he'll be a fine Prime Minister if and when the Australian people give him an opportunity to take on the role. I mean, the reality is we've got a Prime Minister now who is completely out of her depth, who is clearly under pressure, who lacks authority even within her own caucus. She can't even blame Kevin Rudd on her troubles anymore because he's been away for the last 7 or 8 weeks. So, I mean, week after week, whenever you think it can't get any worse, Julia Gillard finds a way to self-inflict more damage on herself and on her government. So, I mean, really, it is time in the national interest to bring this to a close, and the best way to resolve all of this is by taking Australia to a general election.
Well, panel, I wrote in my article today that I took a bit of a straw poll of some of the most senior members of the press gallery, and they've never seen it this bad. You know, some of the examples that were put to me was 75 with Gough Whitlam, but even by the very end there, he'd started to slightly improve, and there was also some inspiration around him, even though there was concerns along the way. One senior member of the gallery talked about the final days of Hawke just before Keating took him out after he'd already stepped aside as Treasurer. But he said again that wasn't as bad as this. And the much talked about Howard era between 98 and 01, where he had his problems before Tampa and September 11, they pretty much all agreed that as low as Howard got at different points, it was nothing like where the government's at now. Well,
you know, to give you a Labor Party analogy, if you look at the dying months of the Keating government or the dying months of the Whitlam government, the last 2 times Labor lost office, they had an inspirational, bold, visionary agenda, which the Labor true believers were locked into. They probably knew or didn't want to know the government was collapsing, but they loved those governments. They believed in those governments as governments that were big, bold, impressive, imaginative, creative governments. Now, the true believers don't believe that about the Gillard government, and that's a horrible thing for the Labor Party to find itself in, as it looks like it's coming close to an end, or it's almost unrecoverable. It's not over yet, but it's close to that.
And Greg O'Mahony, the true believers are a lot thinner on the ground now as well. We're into the 20s in terms of Labor's primary vote.
That's right, and someone like Troy's no longer writing speeches for its doyens. No, I don't think the problem is just the polling.
Because Rudd's speeches were so inspirational.
Well, they've changed a lot. They've changed a lot since you left, Troy. But I don't think it's
I also wrote a couple of speeches for Julia Gillard too, but you know, I don't talk about that much.
Nor does she.
Don't take credit. Don't take credit, Troy.
I don't think it's about the polls. I think it's about the policy. And I think that if you look at this Malaysia solution, the legal problems, the least of the government's problems on that score, it was shocking policy, shockingly developed. I mean, the PNG solution, the East Timor solution, culminating in a solution that sent children unaccompanied to one of the worst human rights perpetrators in the region. It was nonsensical, and it flew in the face of everything Gillard stood for the better part of 10 years.
And Senator Cormann, the gentleman responsible for it, the Immigration Minister Chris Bowen, previously held the portfolio that you hold in opposition, financial services. I mean, this has been a real body blow to his career, you would think.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, you'd have to feel a bit sorry for Chris Bowen for having sort of been handed this poisoned chalice. I mean, I would say the person really to blame for the fiasco at our borders is, well, Kevin Rudd, as then Prime Minister, who decided to change the policy, and Chris Evans. I mean, I sat across the chamber of Chris Evans for 3 years in the first term of the Rudd government, when he kept lecturing us on how offshore processing didn't work and how offshore processing was terrible. And they, of course, dismantled in the Rudd government, with Chris Evans as Immigration Minister, the very successful Howard government policies on offshore processing, temporary protection visas and so on.
Senator, can I ask you, though, as a build-on from that, though, can I ask you about the potential implications of this judgment for other forms of offshore processing? I mean, it is possible here, and there is some legal advice floating around that suggests this, that this puts in doubt Manus Island, it puts in doubt Nauru now. What does the coalition do in response to that? Does it hold the line on its policy on these fronts, or does it take that legal advice into account vis-à-vis this new decision by the High Court?
Well, what legal advice? Because, I mean, there's been some sort of, suggestions of legal advice, and at some point Julia Gillard said she was going to release legal advice, and then she's not going to release it. We don't accept that the High Court judgment has got those sorts of implications for Nauru. We think that offshore processing in Nauru can take place and should take place in the current legal framework. And in fact, the High Court made a special point to point out that the arrangements as proposed for Malaysia were quite different from what was happening on the ground in Nauru. But having said all of that, I mean, Tony Abbott very constructively and very positively has offered to the Prime Minister to work in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that offshore processing in Nauru can happen. So it's really up to the government. I mean, if there is a requirement to make changes to the legislative framework, then the Prime Minister should work with Tony Abbott to make sure that that can happen through the Parliament as expeditiously as possible.
I saw that, a very helpful offer by Tony Abbott to put politics to one side and provide tips and assistance on how to implement Nauru. Well, we've only got 2 minutes.
Partisanship is dead.
We've only got 2 minutes left on program, but Senator, can I ask you very quickly and then bring the panel in? Serious question. Don't spin to me if you can. The talk of Mal Brough coming into Parliament potentially. Last week there was an article about the possibility of other former Howard government ministers and new talent coming in. This is all going to put pressure on existing people who either want into the ministry or are already in the shadow ministry but may find themselves not there after a thumping election victory. How does Abbott hold all of this together without having people's personal individual ambitions get in the road of unity?
I mean, look, I mean, every time when you approach an election, whether it's the Liberal Party or the Labour Party or the National Party for that matter, you go through a pre-selection process before you go through the general election. And it's a matter for Liberal Party members across Australia to make judgments as to who they think is best equipped to represent
But you'd concede that Abbott just does need to be careful here, because oppositions can find themselves suddenly falling into a state of disrepair. Now, he's done a great job so far from a political perspective. He doesn't want to put that at risk.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's always a matter of getting the balance right between having the right mix between experience and between new talent coming in. And of course, that'll be our challenge in the lead-up to this next election, as it is our challenge in the lead-up to any election. And look, I mean, very clear, I'm sure that everybody is very mindful of the need to do everything we can to make sure we have the best possible chance to win the next election.
All right, Senator Cormann.
That's in the national interest.
Senator Cormann out of Perth, we appreciate you joining us, as you do each fortnight on Saturday Agenda. Thanks for your company. And thanks to the panel as well. Troy Bramston, former speechwriter to Kevin Rudd, and Dr. Greg O'Mahony, who joins me each week. Thanks for your company.
Pleasure, Pete.
And thank you for your company. Be sure and tune in to Australian Agenda tomorrow here on Sky News, where we've got Peter Garrett, the Environment Minister, live in the studio, plus Bronwyn Bishop, responsibility for ageing, and a portfolio that Tony Abbott has made clear will be a cabinet posting if he wins the election, a return for Bronwyn Bishop in the latter part of her career. I'm Peter van Onselen. Thanks for your company.